Hi there. In our last video, we talked about function configurations. In this video, we're going to be talking about function parameters. All right. So let's get an idea of what parameters are. So let's switch over to MDN. A parameter is a named variable passed into a function. Parameter variables are used to import arguments into a function. So basically, this is the standard term of what parameters are in software development. And as you can see here, we have a sample function, we have a parameter, that parameter is passed into a function, and this is how the function is being executed with set parameter argument foo passed into it. The exact same thing applies in the Inhouz Cloud platform. Parameters are basically arguments that are passed into functions, and they become available uh, within the function's runtime. So on the in-house platform, you can define your parameters. But before we do that, let's talk about what we call system generated parameters. So on the in-house platform, every single function has what we call system generated parameters. These are parameters that the system gives to you by default, and you can provide everything else. So basically, the idea behind this is this, that there are certain parameters that are always required within every single function. And instead of having users always have to provide these parameters, the system automatically provides it for convenience. So let's go top to bottom. There are two types of system generated parameters. There are client and there are API parameters. So basically, client parameters are parameters that exist on web applications. So this will be any application that runs on the browser. These parameters will be available. And API parameters are parameters that are only available in API, in functions that are used in APIs. All right, so it's a very simple concept. Client is web and API is API functions. So if we go from the top to the bottom, so app data. So basically, app data is your app's state. So this is basically all the data in your app state. So every single function that triggers from within a web application will have this app data in it. So you can reference anything in your app state from any function on the Inhouse Cloud parameter that runs in the web. Events. So if a function is attached to an event, let's say on click, on double click, on hover, whatever, on mouse over or mouse out, any event that a function is attached to will have the events object. This is the JavaScript object that the browser is providing for that event. That this parameter is made available to you by the system by default. In list. So basically, this tells you, hey, the function is triggering from an element that is within a list. So if you are, running an on-click event or on hover or whatever, from anything that exists within a list, and in this case, lists are the actual list elements or tables, right? So table rows and list elements, list items, those are basically we'll consider as lists on the in-house cloud platform. So basically, the in list parameter will tell you, true or false if a function is being executed from an entity that exists within a list. Now, if this is true, then there will be a list item data. The list item data is basically just the row data. So if you had a list, that list row, that will be the list item data. If it was a table, the table row, that row data will be the list item data. The list item index is basically the line or the number of the row that the function is being triggered from. So if the function is being triggered from the first row, then this is going to be index 0. And if the function is triggering from the second row, it's going to be index 1. This is basically the same concept of indexes in languages like JavaScript, Java, you name it. This is basically just the index, which is usually the length or the number or minus one. The path to list item. Again, if you're in a list, the list usually has some paths to it. Maybe you're looking at, user dot hobbies, and the list is the hobbies, right? So the path to the list will be user dot hobbies, right? So basically, this is useful when you want to maybe update certain data from within the list. We do have recursive functions that will help you update data down any structure. We're going to get into those types of functions in the future videos. But basically, if you wanted to know how the data structure traverses to a list, um, this is where you get that from. And again, this is based on where the function is being triggered from, right? And this is also client only. Now, user, this is client and API. So let's explain what a user is. A user is basically the entity, the authenticated entity that is accessing your function. So from a client's perspective, which is the web, this will be a logged in user. So if a user is logged in, then uh, that user with all his or her information will be reflected in the user parameter. When in an API, there are two types of users. There's an actual user. Let's say the user has an API key, the user is subscribed to an API, then that user's information will be available. That user will be very similar to the user that is logged into a web application. And there's another type of user for APIs called system users. So these system users are basically just, they have the same profiles as regular users, but they don't have an account, right? Their sole purpose is basically have access to APIs. So on the client, users have to log in. On the APIs, users have to provide their access token or their access API keys. User agents. This is basically just a description of the user's request based on certain things like, are they making a request from a mobile phone? Are they making a request from, you know, uh, are they a bot? What kind of, are they using Windows? This just gives a lot of information about a user who is interacting with a function. From the web, it's based on what the browser provides, and from an API, it's based on whatever the networking layer provides. Route parameters. So route parameters are basically just what they are, in web pages and APIs. There are route parameters, and you can have access to these parameters within your function in the route parameter, right? So if we looked at this route over here, functions will be considered a route parameter. This is a dynamic parameter. And if, let's say, this function were to be triggered from a page, uh, functions will be one of my route parameters. Query string parameters are basically query string parameters, similar to route parameters. Uh, they, will be extracted from wherever the route is for an API or from a user's address bar, web page address bar, and they will be provided by default in a function, in every function. And then we get to this last two. These are basically API only parameters, and we have the request headers. So basically, these request headers are, all the headers, in an API request. The uh, cores, a header, perhaps, possible API keys, and so on and so forth. All these parameters will be available in all these details, and all the headers will be available in the request header parameter in API, uh, uh, in functions that execute in an API. And then we have the request body. So post request and put request usually allow for a request body. and this request body will be provided in the request body parameter. So if you write a function that that is executed in an API that allows for a request body, then you want to look for your request body in the request body parameter. This is provided for you by default. Now that we've gone through all the system generated parameters, let's take a quick look at user generated parameters. So these are parameters that you would have to provide every single time that you consume a function. So basically, I could basically just say, uh, I could basically just enter a parameter called sample parameter and give it a name sample. And all right, so we have our parameter called sample. You can give it a description. I just say, random description. Now, it's very, very important that you give a description that makes sense because whenever a user is going to enter the parameter, they might want to understand what exactly this parameter is doing. So a detailed description will come in very handy. You get to pick the type. In this case, I'm just going to say string, and you get to pick the default. So the default is going to come into play if, let's say, the user doesn't provide this parameter, then the default will be used. All right, and that's it. So now we have one parameter. We can create as many as we want by just simply entering it, and the form, keeps on giving you the next bits. And you can obviously update a parameter by just clicking on it and editing said parameter. And that's all you need to know about parameters. Parameters are basically arguments that are passed into a function. Because of the Inhouz Cloud, uh, functions are used in so many different places in web apps, APIs, automations. We decided that it was best to provide a bunch of system generated parameters. That way you don't have to pass these parameters every single time, you know, into your functions. You can just start building and writing your functions. And in the cases where you actually need parameters from the user, you can basically just create those, and those will be accessible from within your applications with ease. All right, that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll talk about workflows.